have to express thanks to Kyle publicly for pinch hitting this morning. Chad's feeling a bit under the weather, but Kyle didn't know he was leading singing, I think, until about 5 minutes before service, and he's doing a wonderful job singing another man's selected songs, which I'm not a song leader, but I have to imagine isn't always the easiest thing to do, so we're thankful for that.
Amen.
We're continuing our study here in the book of Philippians. I hope you'll turn there, Philippians chapter 2. We'll be looking at verses 17 through 30, of course, as was read for us by our brother Luke. He asked me beforehand just to make sure that was the scripture reading. I know it's a little lengthier than usual, but that's the text that we'll be looking at this morning as we consider the book of Philippians under the theme Acquiring the Mind of Christ, specifically this morning, Acquiring the Mind of Christ on Service. Acquiring the Mind of Christ on Service. And as we go through this section of the book of Philippians, we're going to see 3 examples of Christ-minded service, and we're going to take 3 lessons from those 3 examples, things I hope that we can put into practice ourselves. I think all of us have heard of William Shakespeare. He's considered the greatest writer of all time. He's known not only for his plays, which are quite numerous and well-known, both his tragedies and his comedies, but also he wrote quite a bit of poetry. And one of his most famous lines, there's a couple that really stick out, but one of his most famous lines from one of his plays, Hamlet, is, "To be or not to be, that is the question." You've probably heard that before. It really is an interesting thing. If you ever watch that play or read that play, the context of that question really is Hamlet, dwelling on some very negative things. And it really is a question that Shakespeare wrote from the mouth of Hamlet, to be or not to be, that is the question, really is a question of life or death. It is a question of existential reality. Am I going to keep going or am I not? I think sometimes as Christians we have this question floating in our minds, to serve or not to serve. And sometimes that's our question. And I would argue, just like for Hamlet, that was an existential question, a question of life or death, this for the Christian is an existential question. It's a question of life or death. It's not just a matter of what we will do with our time. It's not just a matter of what we're willing to give up or what we're willing to sacrifice. This is a matter of being like Christ or not. This is a matter of truly following him or not, when we are posed with this question, to serve or not to serve. And there will be times, because of our abilities, because of our talents, because of our opportunities, God in his providence will put us in a place where we have the opportunity to serve our neighbor, to serve our brother, to serve his kingdom, and we will be faced with this question, to serve or not to serve. And I hope and pray that the examples we read here in Philippians chapter 2 will inspire us to serve whenever we're faced with this question, as many of us are already doing. I hope we will continue to do so. So let's notice 3 examples together, 3 examples of Christ-minded service, and then we'll look at the 3 big lessons we gain from these 3 examples as we consider the very important aspect of serving as a Christian and following our Lord in that service. The first example we're going to see is the example of Paul himself. Notice Philippians chapter 2, and the screen says verses 17 and 18, but we'll actually start in verse 16 just to get a little bit of context. And in verse 16, Paul is commanding the Philippians all these different things for them to live as lights in the world. Our brother David preached on that last Sunday in the second service. And in verse 16, he tells them that they should be holding fast the word of life, so that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run or labored in vain. So he goes from them, he transitions from a focus on them to a focus on himself. He says, if you stay the course, if you stay faithful, it will be the case that I haven't labored in vain, that my work for you and with you was worth it. But then he turns attention to himself. And notice verses 17 and 18 and how the apostle describes his service. He says, yes, and if I'm being poured out as a drink offering on the sacrifice and service of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all. For the same reason, you also be glad and rejoice with me. Here, Paul uses 3 images of Old Testament worship. 3 images of things you would read in books like Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. When you read about the service of the Levites, when you read about all those different sacrifices that, thank God, we're not obliged to give today as Christians, though we do have sacrifices to give, namely ourselves as a living sacrifice. Paul uses 3 words that harken back to this imagery. Notice what he says there, The first is that of a drink offering. He says, if I'm being poured out as a drink offering. If you have an older translation, the King James, for example, refers to that as a libation. And it was an offering in the Old Testament. It was wine, and there was a certain amount you were supposed to give, that you were supposed to pour on your sacrifice when you gave it to God. But not only that, he says, if I'm being poured out as a drink offering on the sacrifice and service of your faith. That word sacrifice, again, harkens back to Old Testament imagery. It really just means an offering. It means I'm giving up something. I'm giving something to God. And then there's that word service. It's the Greek word from which we get our English word liturgy. But it refers to religious service in the tabernacle or in the temple. In fact, if you read through the book, for example, of Exodus or Leviticus or Numbers, you'll read about the service of the Levites, the service of the sons of Aaron. And in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it's that same word that Paul uses here. It's not just service, it's religious service. It's service to God for the case or for the idea of serving him and giving him what he's worth. I think it's easy to miss what Paul is saying here. What Paul is saying is that the Philippians had made an offering. Notice again in verse 17, he says, if I'm being poured out as a drink offering on the sacrifice and service of your faith, I'm glad and I rejoice. Paul's saying that by their faith, by their sacrifice, by their service, by their offering as Christians, not only in supporting Paul, but in preaching the gospel and in living the Christian life, that they're making an offering, that their faith is a religious service, as it were. And Paul is simply the drink offering that goes with it. And the reason why this is interesting, because there's two chapters in the Old Testament, Numbers chapter 15 and Numbers chapter 28, that reveal something very interesting to us. And it's something that I never really realized before I was studying for this lesson. And the thing that Numbers 15 and Numbers 28 reveals to us is that every sacrifice in the Old Testament, every offering that an Israelite would bring to the tabernacle or to the temple for the priest to offer, every single one, whether it was a peace offering or a trespass offering or a sin offering or even a grain offering, every single offering was finished off, was accompanied in the last place by a drink offering. It's as if that's the way you sealed the offering. That was the last thing you would offer to God. That's the last thing you would pour out in the sacrifice to God. Whether it be a ram or a goat or a bull or whatever, whether it be however much flour mixed with oil, the cakes that they would offer to the Lord. The last piece was always the libation. The last piece was always the drink offering. And Paul's metaphor here is, if the Philippians, as they live their Christian life, as they sacrifice to God, as they offer their lives as sacrifices to God, if Paul is that last part on top that gets completely poured out, completely drained, completely exhausted to make that sacrifice pleasing to God, Paul says, I will rejoice. I'll be glad. Not only that, in verse 18 he says, I expect you to be glad with me. Paul says, I'm willing to be the one who's exhausted. I'm willing to be the one through my sacrifice, my effort, my striving, my serving. I'm willing to be the finishing piece, as it were, making your sacrifice pleasing to God. And Paul is saying, if I have to be completely exhausted, if I have to die to make your faith pleasing to God, it will be worth it. If I have to give it all up, if I have to be poured out, as it were, Paul says, I will be glad, I will rejoice. Not only that, I expect you to rejoice with me. Now, the only way this makes sense, the only way Paul's able to say this, the only way especially he's willing to tell the Philippians, you need to rejoice with me. The only way that makes sense is if there's a life after this one. The only way that makes sense is if this life is not all there is. Imagine if I told you that I was going to die, that I was going to sacrifice, that I was going to give it all up, and maybe you cared for me very much. Pretend for a moment that you care for me very much. And I told you, I'm going to give it all up. I'm going to be poured out. I'm going to be completely exhausted, completely wiped, completely spent. I'm going to die. And I expect you to be glad and rejoice. You would say, how? How could I? I love you too much. I care for you too much. But Paul's saying there's something more important than Paul. There's something more important even than the feelings of the Philippians, and that is service to God. Because this life is not all there is. Because there is something after this. And Paul says, I'm being poured out. And if I am, I'm going to rejoice, and I expect you to rejoice with me. That's the first example we have, the example of Paul himself. The second example we have is the example of Timothy, Paul's son in the faith, the one whom Paul converted a lot of people, but one of the men Paul converted. And then after he's converted, he follows Paul around and joins Paul in that work of not only planting churches, encouraging Christians, preaching the gospel. And we can read in 1st and 2nd Timothy, letters written to Timothy, some of the things Timothy was expected to do. But Paul moves here from himself to focus on Timothy, Paul's son in the faith. Now the Philippians knew Timothy well. Turn back to Philippians chapter 1, verse 1 with me, if you would. Philippians 1, verse 1, it's easy to miss. But notice what Philippians 1, verse 1 says. Who's this letter from? Paul and Timothy, bondservants of Jesus Christ. In fact, if you read through Paul's letters, you will notice that 2 Corinthians, Philippians, Colossians, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, Philemon all start the same way. Paul and Timothy to these churches, to these people. And of course, Timothy's name is on 2 letters itself, letters when Paul wrote to him. But Paul focuses on Timothy because Paul is going to send Timothy their way. Notice verse 19. Notice what the apostle writes there. But I trust in the Lord Jesus. I'm going to be poured out. If I do, I pray, I glorify, hope you'll celebrate as well. But I'm going to send Timothy to you shortly, that I also may be encouraged when I know your state. What is he doing? He wants Timothy to go and to see the Philippians and give a report back to him. But notice how he describes Timothy. And here's really what's important for our purposes. Notice how the apostle describes his son in the faith, Timothy. The first is that Timothy is like-minded. Look at verse 20. He says, I have no one like-minded. In that English translation, it almost weakens what Paul is saying in the Greek. It's one Greek word, and it means one soul. And he's saying that Timothy and I, it's almost as if we have the same soul. That's how close we are to each other. Timothy and I, you ever been really close friends with somebody? Maybe your spouse is like this. You can finish each other's sentences. It's like you're in each other's head. You know where the other's going. You know what the other's going to be saying. You know what the other wants. Paul says, that's Timothy and me. We're one-minded. We're one-souled, if you will. Notice how he describes him, not only as we're one-souled, we're one-minded, but notice in the next place, verse 20, he will sincerely care for your state. So it's not just that Paul and Timothy are close, it's that Timothy is a certain kind of person. He is somebody who will sincerely care for the state of the Philippians. I don't need to tell you this. You know, there's a lot of fake carers out there. A lot of people who just kind of pretend like they care about you to go through the motions, maybe to get something out of you. And I don't mean any disrespect here to anybody who works in this industry, but I think we've all been to a restaurant and have had a waiter or a waitress who was especially attentive. And by the time you left the meal, you almost felt like you were that person's best friend. You felt like you could invite them to your birthday party or to dinner at your house. And I'm not saying they didn't mean it, but you have to wonder if they weren't motivated by the prospect of a tip at the end of the meal, would they have been as nice? Would they have been as attentive? Would they have been as careful? We don't know. We can never know. But I have to imagine that transactional part of the relationship kind of plays into the behavior oftentimes of those who might serve us at restaurants. We know that there are those who do care, not sincerely, but care just because they're kind of going through the motions or they're expecting something out of you. Maybe they care just to get something in return. Hey, I know if you think I care about you, then maybe I can get something out of you. Now, that's not sincerely caring for somebody. That's not how Timothy cared for the Philippians. He said, I have nobody one-minded, like-minded with me who will sincerely care for you. And he explains why. Look at the next verse in verse 21. For all seek their own, not the things which are of Christ Jesus. He says, I have nobody who will sincerely care about you. And Paul is telling us something here we know. It's an insight into human nature. It's something we've observed in other people and in ourselves. And it's this. Most people are predominantly concerned with one person above all else, and that person is themselves. Myself included. We are concerned predominantly about one person above everybody else, and that person is me. The world tells us, we have a phrase in English in our culture, you got to look out for number one. Well, who's number one? I'm always number one. That's the way the phrase goes. Something interesting. I think it's just programmed maybe in our culture. There's a lot of languages out there. English is the only one of the few that when you refer to yourself in the first person singular, when you say I, you have to capitalize it. Why is that? I don't know. There might be some archaic grammatical reason why we capitalize the letter I. I'm not saying we're, inherently selfish or anything like that, but I think we are programmed to look out for ourselves. We're bombarded by these things in our culture that say, hey, if you don't watch out for yourself, nobody else will. Hey, if you don't take care of yourself, nobody else will. Hey, if you don't look out for yourself, nobody else will. And Paul, lamenting almost, when he considers who's he going to send to Philippi to look in after them, he says, all seek their own, not the things which are of Christ Jesus. There's people he could send to Philippi who are not interested in the Philippians, but who are interested in themselves. And Paul says, Timothy is not one of those people. This is the type of person Timothy was. And Paul alludes to that. Notice the next verse, verse 22. You know his proven character. You know his proven character. That as a son with his father, he served with me in the gospel. Look at this glowing recommendation Paul has of his son in the faith, Timothy. So for all these reasons, as soon as he can, depending on the providence of God, Paul says, I'll send Timothy to you as soon as I can. Look at verses 23 and 24. Therefore, I hope to send him at once as soon as I see how it goes with me. But I trust in the Lord that I myself shall also come shortly. Paul was optimistic that he was able to visit the Philippians as well. That's the second example, Timothy, Paul's son in the faith, somebody who was like-minded with Paul, somebody who didn't look out for his own interests, but looked out for the things of Jesus Christ, as we read in Philippians 2, verse 4, something we should all do. He was somebody who sincerely and genuinely cared for other people. He was somebody who, having known him and been around him, you could see his proven worth, his proven character. That's the second example of service. And the third is a man by the name of Epaphroditus. A man by the name of Epaphroditus. There's many Bible names that are popular to give to our children. I don't know why this one isn't one of them. I've never met anybody named Epaphroditus, have you? I wonder why. He certainly serves a good example. Notice in verses 25 through 30 that how he's described. And it's interesting, Epaphroditus is only mentioned here in the letter of the Philippians. He was a member of the church in Philippi who was sent by the Philippians with a gift for Paul, likely financial, to help him in his imprisonment. But notice how he's described in verse 25. Notice this, again, this glowing recommendation Paul has of Epaphroditus. He says, yet I considered it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus. So he wants to send Timothy, but before he can send Timothy, he has to send Epaphroditus. He says, notice how he's described, my brother, my fellow worker, and fellow soldier, but your messenger. And that word messenger is the Greek word apostle. Apostle just means one sent with a message. Your messenger and the one who ministered, we could say, who served me in my need. Notice how he's described. He's described as a brother. That's familial. Maybe some of you have a brother. I hope you like him, at least. I hope you love him. But we know that language, that familial language, we know that blood is thicker than water, that there is a bond that because we're family is pretty close. So Paul calls him a brother in the Lord. He calls him a fellow worker. That's vocational. Does anybody have co-workers they're close with? I hope so. It's hard to spend that much time with people and not be close to them. He's my fellow worker, but not working for godless things, working for, of course, the gospel. He's my fellow soldier. He uses there, of course, a military term, a military analogy. There's something about the brotherhood we know of soldiers. It's a fraternity. To have each other's six, to have each other's back. We know that forms a pretty close bond. So Epaphroditus and Paul were pretty close. He refers to him as your messenger or your apostle. That speaks to Epaphroditus' purpose. He went to Paul with something, with a message. And then he refers to his actions. He refers to Epaphroditus there in verse 25, who ministered to my need. Do you think Paul had needs? He was in prison. He couldn't go home. He couldn't go to the grocery store. There was no DoorDash or Uber Eats. I feel like that just popped up a couple of years ago, and we're so used to it all of a sudden. Right? How was his needs going to be taken care of? He was dependent on other people coming to him, bringing him gifts, bringing him support, helping him. So Epaphroditus was a minister to his needs. And Paul is sending him back to the Philippians so that they may see him again. And Paul says he was so sick, he would have died if the mercy of God hadn't intervened. So Paul is sending him back so that they can see that he's well. Look at verses 26 through 28. Since he was longing for you all and was distressed because you had heard that he was sick. Now you can imagine why Epaphroditus would be distressed. This is before FaceTime. This is before cell phone calls. If you heard somebody you were close to was sick, and it's a pretty far travel from Philippi to Rome, very distant. You have to get on at least one boat, right? So this is a far away place, and you hear that somebody you care about is sick. Certainly Epaphroditus is thinking, I need to make sure that they know that I'm well. I want them to see me. I want to see them. Notice verse 27. Indeed, he was sick almost unto death, but God had mercy on him. You know, sometimes I think we take things for granted in the modern world. That if you're sick and you got better, it's because of the medicine. It's because of the herbs. It's because of the soup. It's because of whatever. But if you're sick and you get better, it's because of the mercy of God. Paul knew that. Epaphroditus was so sick he almost died. But he got better because God had mercy on him, and not only on him, Paul says in verse 27, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. Imagine, though Paul knew Epaphroditus would be going to his reward, imagine how Paul would feel. You came across the known world just for me, and in doing so you died. Verse 28, therefore I sent him the more eagerly. He wants to send Timothy. He sends Epaphroditus first, that when you see him again you may rejoice, that I may be less sorrowful. Notice how Paul tells him, the Philippians rather, to receive him, and why. Look at this, verse 29, receive him therefore in the Lord with all gladness, and hold such men in esteem. He says Epaphroditus isn't the only one. There's a lot of people like this in the brotherhood. Why? Why should we respect him? Why should we receive him with gladness? Verse 30, because for the work of Christ he came close to death. Notice this, not regarding his life, to supply what was lacking in your service toward me. There's a theme here. Paul says, if I'm poured out on the sacrifice and service of your faith, I will be glad and rejoice. He says of Timothy, he doesn't seek his own interests, he seeks the interests of Jesus Christ. He says of Epaphroditus, he came close to death for the work of Christ, not regarding his life. You see, there's a theme that runs all through these three men. And it's a theme that actually starts earlier in Philippians chapter 2 with a man we all know, at least his name very well, and that is Jesus Christ, who considered his life not something precious to be clung to at all expense, but he considered his life something to be sacrificed for the benefit of others. And now Paul, Timothy, Epaphroditus are all following in the footsteps of Jesus. Let's consider the three lessons we learned from these three men with the little bit of time we have left. First, from the Apostle Paul, we learn this lesson here in verses 17 and 18. Three lessons from three examples. The first from Paul is that Christ-like service is found in a willingness to be joyfully poured out. Notice what the Apostle Paul says, just as he described. It should be our goal, it should be our straining toward this, that we would be glad and rejoice when God uses us, brothers and sisters, but even when God uses us, even to our exhaustion. Even if we're not literally being a martyr, even if we're not literally dying, maybe we're on our last nerve. Maybe we're at the end of our rope because of the service we've offered God and our family, to our neighbors, to his kingdom. Whatever it is, if we're being poured out, we are following in the footsteps of Paul. But there's something that's worth noting. Christ-like service is not just found in being poured out. A lot of people are poured out. A lot of people, by just chance of circumstance, are being poured out. Every mother, every father, every husband, every wife, to one degree or another, is being poured out. Every employee, for the sake of his employer, to one degree or another, is being poured out. Lots of people are being poured out. Lots of people are sacrificing. Lots of people are striving. Lots of people are giving it everything they have. The difference, and where the mind of Christ comes in, is not in being poured out. It is in being joyfully poured out. And that is one of the many things, but one of the central things that separates somebody who's a Christian and somebody who's not a Christian. Many people sacrifice. Many people give it their all. How many people do so joyfully? And so we, with Paul in mind, we with Christ in mind, have to remember who is being honored by our being poured out. If you're poured out for your children, it's not your children who are receiving the honor if you're a Christian. It's God who's receiving the honor. If you're being poured out for your spouse as a Christian, it's not your spouse who's receiving the honor. It's God who's receiving the honor. If you're being poured out for your employer as a Christian, it's not your employer who's receiving the honor. It's God who's receiving the honor. If you're being poured out for his kingdom, for his purposes, for the gospel, to share Jesus with other people, to give it all up so that somebody can see Christ in you, the one who's receiving the honor is God. And that's what ought to motivate us. That's what motivated Jesus. That's what motivated, certainly, the Apostle Paul. We read of Jesus that for the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame. How could Jesus endure the cross? Because he knew the joy that was found in willfully submitting to God the Father. And he's calling us, brothers and sisters, to do likewise. If there's anybody who's ever been poured out, it was Jesus. Not just metaphorically, not just, in an image, but he was literally poured out. Psalm 22, a prophecy about Jesus, refers to his heart melting like wax within him. There's a prophecy in the book of Zechariah that a fountain will be opened up, and this fountain, as it were, will pour out for the forgiveness of sins and the cleansing of the people. It was Jesus' side, of course, from which blood and water came pouring out when he was stabbed by that Roman spear. Brothers and sisters, when we are poured out joyfully, we're following in the footsteps of our Lord and Savior. We're following in the footsteps of our dear brother, the Apostle Paul. We learn from Paul that Christ-like service is found in a willingness to be joyfully poured out. From Timothy, we learn that Christ-like service is found in seeking Christ's interests and not our own. Paul's words, I think, for me, are very convicting. If Paul mentioned me in a letter, how would he describe me? Paul didn't describe everybody in good terms in letters. We've got people like Alexander the coppersmith. We've got people like Demas. We've got people, even well-known false teachers, whom Paul calls out by name and does not describe them in very good terms. If Paul mentioned us in a letter, how would he describe us? It's so convicting for me when Paul says in verse 21, all seek their own, not the things which are of Christ Jesus. To be like Timothy, we should strive to seek Christ's interests and not our own. What's the difference? My interest is to take. Christ's interest is to give for others. My interest is to be rich in stuff. Christ's interest is to be rich toward God. My interest is my house and my comfort. Christ's interest is his kingdom and his righteousness. My interest is my flesh. Christ's interest is my spirit. My interest is now. Christ's interest is eternity. My interest is playing it safe. Christ's interest is putting it all on the line. My interest is defending myself. Christ's interest is turning the other cheek. My interest is being served. Christ's interest is washing feet. My interest is getting even. Christ's interest is praying and working for the salvation of my enemies. My interest is me. Christ's interest is you. And if I have Christ's interests and not my own, I will be a very different kind of person. God help us to seek his interests above our own, realizing that it's not in our eternal best interest to seek our own interests. And that's the trick that Satan plays on us. If you want to succeed, if you want to get ahead, if you want to be comfortable, if you want to live a good life, if you want to be like the people you see on TV and in the magazines and hear about on the radio, you have to seek your own interests. But God gives us another way to success, the way to success. And he says, if you want to be great, you have to make yourself a servant. You have to seek the interests of Christ and not the interests of self. Obviously, we need to survive, we need to live, we need to take care of our families. We can't abandon ourselves just to death for no good reason. But just as Christ submitted to the will of the Father, may we submit to the will of Christ. Brothers and sisters, the last lesson we learned from Epaphroditus is Christ-like service is found in ministering to others while in need ourselves. The Bible doesn't really tell us what illness Epaphroditus had. Of course, he couldn't go to CVS and let them stick a Q-tip up his nose. So it's hard for him to know either way. The Bible also doesn't tell us when and where Epaphroditus got sick. However, most commentators, most scholars agree on this simple fact, and that is that Epaphroditus got sick, not in Rome, but on the way to Rome. That his trip was so prolonged. And Paul spent some time in lack, in need, because Epaphroditus was so delayed. And the Philippians, waiting his return back, were waiting and waiting and waiting and watching their watches or watching their sundials, wondering what was taking Epaphroditus so long to get back. And we don't know where on the journey Epaphroditus got sick. Maybe it was a quarter of the way there. Maybe it was halfway there. Maybe it was 3/4 of the way there. We don't know. But he got sick. And I don't know about you, but if I was sick and on the road, I would want to turn around and come back home. That would be my top priority. But Epaphroditus knew that he had a job to do, that he had a job to complete. He knew that somebody was depending on him. He knew that he could offer service to God if he kept going. He was very sick, almost to death, but is willing to do the work anyway. He was in need, but he ministered to the needs of others, even to the point of risking his own life for the work of Christ. He didn't come back home. He kept going. He pushed through. He pushed forward. And he served God. Many people, unfortunately, myself included, use the excuse of being in need not to do the work of Christ. Sure, there are times when we need rest. There are times when we need to heal. There are times when we need to take a break, not with being a Christian, but with working ourselves to the bones. There are times when we need to take a day for ourselves. But there are also times when, though we are not perfectly well, there is still work that we can do. There are times, although we could list 1,000 excuses, that we know and God knows that there are things we can still do. I can't help but think of Jesus on the cross. If there was ever a man in need, it was Jesus on the cross. Bloodied, beaten, exhausted, thirsty. And I don't think we can really even imagine how thirsty he was. The Psalms tell us that it was as if his tongue clung to the roof of his mouth. Can you imagine being that thirsty? And when you say you're thirsty, they give you vinegar to drink. He was completely poured out. He was putting the interests of others above his own. He had every reason not to be on that cross, but there he was. And while he's on the cross, we could say certainly he's in need. If anybody needs anything, it's this man. If anybody should be rescued, if anybody should be helped, if anybody should be ministered or served, it's this man on the cross there for no crimes of his own. If anybody's ever been in need, it was Jesus Christ. And do you know what the first thing out of his mouth was when he was on the cross? You probably know this. There's 7 things Jesus said when he was on the cross. And if you align them in chronological order, do you know what the first was? Forgive them, Father, for they do not know what they do. It wasn't a prayer to be rescued. It wasn't a prayer to be saved. It wasn't to send the legions of angels. It wasn't to be able to come down off of the cross. Jesus wasn't primarily focused on his needs. He was focused on the needs of even his enemies, even the people who nailed him to that piece of wood. Though needy, he was ministering to the needs of others. Brothers and sisters, where did these men learn to live like this? Was it a school they went to? Was it their parents who trained them this way? No. Paul, Timothy, Epaphroditus learned to live like this from only one source, and that source was Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. Brothers and sisters, as we strive to serve God, let's not forget these examples. Let's not forget these lessons. Let's not forget the one whom we serve and how much he's given for us. I'm standing right now in a room of very talented, very smart people. God has blessed you with gifts, with talents, with abilities, with resources. And God is looking for you to be poured out for him. He's looking for you to value his interests above our own. He's looking for us to, though we are in need, to minister to the needs of others. And maybe in ministering to the needs of others, we will realize that our needs maybe are smaller than we thought they were. Brothers and sisters, I invite all of us, myself included, to come to Jesus, to bow down to him in humility and to say, Jesus, use me. Let me be your servant, to have his mind when it comes to service. But we cannot have the mind of Christ if we have not allowed Jesus Christ to serve us. Maybe you remember when Jesus Christ was washing the feet of the disciples. There was a disciple who said, no, Lord, you shouldn't be washing my feet. I should be washing yours. Of course, we know that disciple is Peter. And maybe you remember what Jesus told Peter. He said, if you do not allow me to wash you, you have no part with me. If you do not allow me to serve you, you have no part with me. And Peter said, don't just wash my feet, wash my whole body, wash my head. He understood this, that before we can render service to Christ, we have to allow Christ to render service to us. We have to humble ourselves at the foot of his cross and say, Jesus Christ, I'm no longer living for myself, I'm living for you. We have to allow the death that he died, the body that he gave, the blood that was poured out to not be vain, to not be empty, to actually mean something for us. Let Jesus Christ serve you this morning so that you can begin to serve him. And if you say, I'm unworthy to be served, you're right, but he loves you so much, he wants you to come anyway, to receive the forgiveness of your sins, to become a disciple, and to start serving God the way he teaches us. Brothers and sisters, may we do just that. Maybe you are in need of the ministry of Christ, the service of Christ. Maybe you need his blood applied to your soul. You can do that this morning. With faith in your heart, repenting of your sins, confessing his sweet name, we can bury you in Jesus Christ for the forgiveness of your sins. And you can have his mind, you can have his heart. He can give you and show you a new way of doing things, and you can serve God. You can serve God in the Christ-like way. If you want to do that, if you need to do that, if you need prayers for strength, as we all do from time to time, I hope you'll come forward while we stand and sing this song.